Escorts of Reddit. What is the saddest experience client-wise you've had while on the job? Story 1. I used to visit a disabled client a while back. Kinda young guy, late 20s and wheelchair bound. I had a whole gamer thing going on because I love video games, so I'd offer to play games with clients. Have some naughty penalties if you lose, that sort of thing. Clients could bring their own games or I had a list. I got a message from this guy and he wanted to play games. Explained he wanted me to come over because he can't come to me. Happy to pay the outcall rates and so on. So I visited and we played some games. He wasn't really interested in the extras, but we did do some stuff in the end. He mostly just wanted to play games and talk and cuddle and whatever. It continued like that each time. I'd come over and we'd watch a movie or play some games and then maybe do some stuff, but not always. He told me that he's lonely and has never had any experience with girls before, and most friends he had abandoned him because of his disability, since it had gotten worse, and he was less active now. Now the only friends he has are online in games. I saw him regularly for about a year and a half. His mother was also aware he was seeing me and was very kind to me. She'd go out when I was there and offer drinks and snacks. She knew who I was but felt like I made him happy, so it didn't bother her. One day I stopped hearing from him. He was a regular client for over a year, so I wondered what happened. Some guys get bored and find another girl, but this just seemed out of character. I went to his house just to see how he was, and his mom told me that he'd had an aneurysm and passed away a week later in hospital. That was one of the saddest experiences of my life. He was a client, but I got to know him intimately over that time, and he became like a close friend. I even got invited to his funeral and accepted. It was much less awkward than you might think. Everyone was really kind to me and non-judgmental, despite hearing what I was to him. How did people at the funeral know who OP was to him? Like, did OP's mom just shame her at the funeral? Like, oh yeah, this is an escort my son hired to play video games with him. Because that reflects poorly on her son. I don't think she'd do that. Either way, OP, this is a great story. I'm sure that guy was so happy to have someone just to, hang out with, no matter how you got there.
We now have a Discord. Check out the server in the link in the description.
Story 2. Not my story, but I knew a girl who did rent-a-night type stuff. Guy asks her if she could come over. Doesn't talk about banging over the phone, just if she could come over and to come hungry. She thinks he's into feeding or some crap, so she arrives at 6 p.m., pretty early for her, and she asks what he would like to do. He just cooks for her. A really huge, delicious meal. Later, he starts to open up a bit. His wife had passed away and always loved his cooking, but he hates cooking for himself. Story 3. I work as a cam girl. There are a lot of sad stories. Dead wives, divorcees, etc. But the one that hit me the hardest was this guy. We'll call him Steve. Steve sends me a message during one of my public shows asking to go private. I go private with him after the show and he just wants to talk about my life. No nudity or anything. And in privates, his cam isn't visible to me. So I sit there talking about my life for about 2 hours at $5 per minute and he doesn't say a word. I finally run out of things to say and he's just like, thanks. Can I buy your Snapchat? Of course I say yes. I give him my Snapchat and he signs off. The next week I get a Snapchat from Steve asking if we can private again. I say sure, we do the same thing. He just wants me to talk about my day and random life stories for 2 hours. We do this once a week for about a month before he asks to Skype where I can see him. I agree. I still literally know nothing about this person. It's our scheduled time to Skype and he doesn't pick up the call. I snap him to make sure everything is okay and he just says he's changed his mind. He just wants to do our usual thing where I can't see him. I say, okay. This time though, he types to me and I respond. Basically, he gives me his life story. He tells me that he's an independent software developer, won't say which for privacy reasons, in Switzerland. He's never had a girlfriend and is a virgin. He's 36 years old. He has crippling social anxiety and says he hasn't spoken to a woman face to face, not even via webcam, since he graduated from college. He says that he's hideously ugly and felt overwhelming guilt for even looking at a woman, because he felt that it was unwanted and offensive to her. I tried to just listen and be understanding. At the end of the conversation, he asked if he could turn on his cam and try to have a conversation with me. I agreed. He turns on his cam and he's a totally average-looking guy. A bit overweight, but a handsome face and a nice haircut, clean looking. I was shocked and just really sad that he thought so lowly of himself. I told him that he was very handsome and that he shouldn't think so low of himself, and we just chatted about life for a few more hours that night before saying goodbye. The next day, I get a Snapchat from Steve. He says that he felt so good about himself that he finally said hi to the front desk receptionist at work, and she said hi back and smiled. He was thrilled about this normal social interaction. We didn't video chat again, but he snapped me every time he interacted with somebody. Last I heard, he has a girlfriend. This woman was just a therapist without even knowing it. It seems to be exactly what the guy needed. Good for both of them, honestly. Story 4. A paraplegic with a traumatic brain injury who laid on the bed and just cried, saying he wished he was dead, and how he'll never even be able to have a girlfriend and has lost the will to live. What do you even say to that? Edit. Not sure why some people think this guy has no agency into making his own decisions about booking an escort. It's also illegal to engage in intimate activities with someone that can't consent. Even if intimate work is legal. Where I live, if there's no consent, it would still be assault. FYI, many of my appointments actually don't involve any banging. They involve companionship. Almost all involve cuddles. A lot of escorts are working in mental health, nursing, psychology, etc., and I assume that is because they are all essentially caring professions. I've also seen clients who suffer from PTSD. One came in to see if they could feel anything from a hug, after seeing their best friend unalived right next to them while deployed overseas. I've even had a mother regularly bring her autistic son because she thought it would do him some good to be with girls after he turned 20. I think some people who have commented on posts on this thread have a really misguided notion of what escort work involves. Story 5. A husband and wife booked me for a threesome, because having a lesbian experience was on her bucket list. She had recently recovered from a double mastectomy and had just been diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor, despite undergoing chemotherapy. In a private, fully clothed moment between the husband and I, he told me she doesn't have long left. And the way they looked at each other was just so beautiful. Just pure love. Story 6. I used to be a cam worker. I had a regular client who would always pay for private time with me. Nothing really did anything intimately for him. He wanted me to dress as a happy housewife and tell him what would be for dinner, and how the 2 dogs and cats, imaginary, are doing. What were their names, and he would tell me we lived in Italy. I forgot where, but he described to me a large house with a pool and all. He pretty much would just fantasy play house with me. I would get really into it, and he would always visit me every day. He was just a very lonely man, and seemed to crave for some human affection and interaction. I felt bad when I just dropped out of the job without warning. I do think about him from time to time. I hope he managed to live his best life. I don't know why that last sentence is in past tense. Is there something you're not telling us, OP? Story 7. Not an escort anymore, but I had one gentleman come in and situate himself on the back wall out of the way of the main commotion. Quiet, bearded lumberjack type in his 40s. I saw him watching me and his eyes follow me around the place when I got off stage. He shooed off all the other girls who came up to him. Normally, it would be very creepy, but he had this very, I'm not sure how to describe it, but tired vibe around him. One of the bouncers came by and said that guy was asking for me, so I approached and sat across his table from him. The other girls had been sitting next to him or even in his lap, and he seemed to really not like that, so I gave him his space. Anyway, I just started making small talk with him, and it came up that his wife had recently died. He could barely get it out. He was on the verge of bawling. And, of course, I reminded him a lot of her, looks and personality-wise. I sat and listened and spoke softly occasionally. I felt so bad for him. He was clearly broken. Eventually, I gently told him that this place was a cheap and shallow substitute for what sounded like a very lovely lady. It wasn't a great place, and I told him he should go home because she wouldn't be found here. But of course, he was welcome to see me anytime. He seemed a little better and agreed with me, and he didn't know what the hell he was doing there. He just missed her so much. He chuckled and said it was like his wife was speaking to him through me, that she would have told him the exact same thing. He didn't pay me at all for the hour of time he took with me, but I didn't mind. He's one of the only patrons I've had that I still think about from time to time, and wonder/hope he's doing much better now. A lot of guys would come in and just want to talk. No dances, just company. But he was, by far, the saddest. I've always said if you want to be a therapist, but don't want to get a PhD, go into escort work. Half your job is going to be listening to someone vent about their problems anyway. Story 8. I had a few clients in my hometown and neighboring city. They were somewhat older, more career-accomplished women who wanted discreet companionship. Most of them just wanted to cuddle and talk or listen to music and lay with me. Some liked drugs, and almost all of them liked wine. All of them were lonely. One of my clients was constantly out at parties or business functions, very social and successful, and she would contact me after. On Christmas one year, she told me that she was previously married. Her husband started her business with her before he died. She told me she lived the happiest life with him, but that it was too short. I think she was looking for a similar replacement for her husband, but nobody lived up to him. Relationships are hard and then we die. Story 9. I used to work the text lines. This was before smartphones, which are, by the way, a massive scam. Worker logs into a website, picks up an incoming message. The screen had a sidebar telling you who you were, name, age, hair, etc., and a box for notes on what was going on. With the regulars, this ended up being extensive. One client spent over £25,000 texting a girl who didn't exist. We had a few who wanted to meet. We had to tell them some BS about we couldn't. Another worker didn't do their job right, and because it's really hard to backpedal, I ended up with a client who thought he was going to one day meet a girl and got chewed out by management. The entire thing was just sad when you think about it. Story 10. Not sure if this qualifies, but if strippers do, I worked at a restaurant before, and there have been a couple of really sad ones. We're near a hospital, so a lot of folks would just come by for dinner while a loved one was there. One guy came in and ordered and also asked for ketchup packets and pepper to bring back for his wife to use on her meal. He told me she was in the hospital to deliver a baby, but something had gone wrong and the baby had already died. And she was hanging on, but it seemed like there was something bad going on there. He didn't elaborate and I didn't ask. I ended up buying his meal for him and ended up crying with another waitress after he left. Also had a guy who I think was maybe a railroad guy, we had a lot of them too, who paid for his meal and tipped and all, and then we got to talking and he was talking about how depressed he was and how much he wished he would just die. I worked there during a really hard time in my life, because believe me, no one stays there longer than a few months if their lives are going to be okay. So I could relate. I talked to him about how antidepressants were really helping me, and that there were other options he had. At the end of another hour, he offered me $20 since he'd taken up so much of my time, and I told him, nah. I figure he needed to know that someone just actually cared. They weren't acting for money. Also had a guy with his little 1 to 2 year old who was acting up and screaming, and he just seemed so desperate and depressed. He said his wife was always having some catastrophe and kept trying to unalive herself, and he didn't know if he could take it, but he didn't know if he divorced her if she would unalive herself. In hindsight, sounds like she was some sort of mentally ill. He was some sort of military. I think he was in fatigues. And I think he didn't know what to do, because he couldn't even be sure he could trust his wife with their daughter if he got deployed. He ended up leaving pretty soon after, because the little girl was having a tantrum. Okay, so some good stories in here for sure. Never heard the term breastaurant before. That's hilarious. But yes, OP seems like a very sensitive person and seems to have done a lot of people good. So good on them, but also breastaurants. Story 11. Not mine, but I thought I would share one that I saw somewhere on the internet once. There was a girl about 21 years old who had been in the industry for a few months. She had experienced a variety of clients already, and said she felt satisfied helping those who just wanted to feel loved, men and women alike. One day, a woman in her early 40s came and requested the youngest girl, which had happened to be her. She paid for a couple hours and requested her to just wear casual pajamas. When she got to the woman's room in her PJs, the woman had some Disney movie loaded up, and told the girl her daughter was becoming a teen and had no interest in watching kids' movies anymore and cuddling. They spent the next 2 to 3 hours just cuddling, eating snacks, and watching Disney movies. She had stated it brought her to tears and made her leave the industry and move back home and go back to school. But she wanted it to be clear, being in the intimate industry doesn't always mean it's for banging. Some people just want to cuddle or spoon. They're just looking to satisfy something that they can't otherwise. Story 12. I worked as an escort for about a year and a half. I had a regular client with a number of mental health issues in his mid-30s. He was an Asian guy whose family didn't believe in mental illness. He wouldn't socialize with anyone except for his family. He had a mental breakdown the year prior and had to quit his job. He had to sell his house and move back in with his parents. He had never banged anyone who wasn't an escort. He had never been on a date with a woman or had any female friends. He would book overnight appointments with me and we just wouldn't even bang. He just wanted the company. That's $3,500 he was paying per sleepover with me. All he would ever want to do was talk and cuddle. He once told me I was his best friend, and how sad that was considering he had to pay me, and if there was no payment, I wouldn't even be there. Broke my heart. I cared for him very much, and I still think of him from time to time. Story 13. I've worked as a dominatrix and as an escort, and my saddest experience was one of my submissives. I saw this client a few times. He was morbidly obese but very intelligent, funny, and had a successful career. He was heavily into receiving pain, and our sessions were on the more extreme end. Afterwards, though, he would want to cuddle and just chat and laugh. One day, after our session, he told me he was finally retiring, and he was going to solo travel and have some experiences. Not long after, a coworker who was a friend of his, outside of work, told me he had passed away. Based on timeline, I doubt he ended up vacationing. I've had other clients who were depressed in bad marriages or unhappy with their lives, but he was the only client I've had that I'd known to pass away, and under such sad circumstances. Story 14. Dancer here. I've had a bunch of clients that would take me into a booth and then just start crying. I felt bad for them, but I do my best to console them, and I never rip off customers. However, one night, this guy came in with about $5,000 to $10,000 in cash. I don't exactly know how much. A few girls approached him but left quickly. I went to talk to him and he wanted to go for a dance but needed help walking and stuff as he was very old. We got to the booth and he started talking about his deceased wife who died while she was pregnant and how he wished she was there and can I find a fat dancer instead so he could pretend it's his pregnant dead wife. Kinda weird, but I happen to work in childcare, so I told him that and asked if he'd like to hear stories of the children I take care of. He said yes. And so I told him different cute stories of children I take care of. He took out a huge wad of hundreds and set it down on the little table next to the couch. I was going to spend the entire night with him and only charge what I earned per hour, which would have been plenty anyway. However, a few other dancers noticed the money, so they bribed the bouncer to kick me out on a fake account of letting the guy touch my kitty, and then the bouncer stole the stack from the guy saying he broke the rules, and split the cash with two of the dancers. I never worked there again. Story 15. There was a man who wanted me to come over around 4 a.m., which was late, but he seemed fairly attractive and he offered to pay handsomely. I get there and we make small talk, and usually either the small talk turns to flirting, which turns into banging, or the small talk dies down and I suggest we head to the bedroom. However, this time it seemed really difficult to get him to talk frisky at all, and he seemed a little distraught the entire time. And I was almost a bit disappointed because he was indeed fairly attractive. Eventually, I start getting to kiss him a bit, but he seems reluctant, and after a second he pulls away and says he can't do this. Apparently, it was the anniversary of the death of his son, and he had only hired me to distract him. However, once I got there, he realized that I, a man if you were unaware at this point, looked like and reminded him too much of his son, and he couldn't go through with it. He talked to me about him for a while, and at one point we tried to see if it would be helpful for him to talk to me like I was his son, but it was too painful for him. I was only there for half an hour. I didn't try to take any money from him since we didn't bang, but he wouldn't let me leave without paying me the full amount, and then some. Poor guy wanted a distraction and got a very visceral reminder instead. I feel bad for him. This poor man. Can you imagine deciding to hire an escort because in your brain it's like the furthest thing from your dead son you could possibly think about? And then he shows up and you're like, ah, no, you look exactly like him. Seriously, like, all jokes aside though, that is rough. Story 16. Throwaway for obvious reasons. My family is well connected in my state. Lots of friends in the medical profession, attorneys, politics, etc. Small town and small towns around us. I was having issues with family, self-worth, friends while I was in college. I was really depressed and on some meds that fed my depression, medical thing. Friends weren't helpful. I felt truly alone. I felt like I couldn't seek out therapy without it being spread around vocally like a virus. I sought out an escort in a larger city while I took a vacation to just talk to. I know it was sad, I know it was pathetic, but I felt like I was on the verge of a final breakdown. Had attempted self-unaliving a few years earlier and failed due to my incompetence. While everyone's situation is different, mine was actually darkly comedic. Parents didn't want to acknowledge it. Parents' friends, who is my treating ER physician, just accused me of doing drugs and called it a waste of time. I screwed up and took the wrong meds in the cabinet. Was self-medicating beforehand. Parents weren't aware. Accused me of doing drugs while I was drugged on the hospital bed. So on and so on. Felt like a dark Seinfeld episode. All in all, the girl I hired was helpful with just listening. She didn't judge me, openly at least. She just listened and provided feedback when I asked a question. I understood her role in it, and she understood what I was looking for. She was kind enough to recommend professional help, and I remember her saying that with all the craziness in the world, we all have a place. Take it for what it's worth now, but it meant a lot to me at the time. I met with her 2 other times afterwards. A decade later, I'm much happier. Came to terms with things, sought out therapy, no longer in it, happily married with children. I couldn't see myself leaving them. There's my short story. Took a lot to type that. But I did it because I want others to know that it may be pathetic or feel sad to do this. But if you are where I was and just need someone to talk to, there is always someone available. And I don't regret it for a minute.